fantastic talk, Ray, and please line up at the microphone for your questions and answers. Great. Perfect.
Hi, Ray. Linda McDonald, Glen, Albany Medical School. Could you go back to slide number 99 for a second? It was something I just wanted to ask you about. What you said about the biological versus non-biological intelligence. One of the things that I've heard you say before, and I think it's just a great quote, is that there's going to be no us versus them. We're all going to be part of the same group. Don't you think it's going to be harder and harder to distinguish between what is biological and what is non-biological? Because
well, absolutely, because you're not going to be able to go in a room and say, okay, humans on the left, computers on the right. In 2035, a typical biological person, even one that's, say, very conservative and a late adopter, is going to have a lot of intelligent technology in their bodies and brains. And because of the law of accelerating returns, that non-biological intelligence is going to grow exponentially, not because it's self-replicating, but that's just the nature of the technology. So it ultimately will be where the action is and will be far more powerful than the biological technology. By 2045, I estimate the non-biological intelligence of the human civilization will be 1 billion times greater than the biological intelligence. That's why we call it a singularity. It's a profound transformation. But it is going to be all mixed up. And even if you have a completely non-biological system, it's derived from human intelligence, it's modeled in human intelligence, it's going to be human-like. This is human intelligence. It's one reason I actually take issue with the term transhumanism, because we're not going to transcend our humanity. We're going to transcend our biology, the limitations of biology. And doing that is exactly what humanity is all about.
And in fact, don't you foresee people doing this with animals? Other non-humans?
Well, that question has come up, and yeah, it's hard to give any reasons why that wouldn't happen. So
it's an interesting question, and hypothetical we can discuss later.
Finally see or hear what your cat has to say.
So. When I think about why my life today is so much, I live longer and my life is far better than my ancestors 1,000 years ago in the savannah that you alluded to. One of the reasons is that we have so many more people who are thinking of solutions to problem. I mean, here's a good example of people thinking about, their thoughts will then lead to a longer life for tomorrow. So my point is that the information explosion is accompanied, actually, it goes hand in hand with a population explosion. And so it's actually good to have more people, not fewer. And population growth, in fact, is a good thing because there'll be more people thinking about answers to problems.
Well, I mean, one of the concerns that people express about life extension, particularly radical life extension, is it'll lead to overpopulation. And I think, it's a mistake to take one trend, such as life extension, and place it on today's world as if nothing else is going to happen. The same technologies that are going to lead to life extension will also lead to increased resources, like nanotechnology applied to solar energy. Ultimately will provide very inexpensive energy. There are other technologies, if we had more time, we could talk about that are emerging for water and for food production, like in vitro cloning of vegetables in factories, in vitro meat production in factories by cloning muscle tissue. I mean, there's all kinds of technologies that could be subject to the law of accelerating returns. So I don't see resources as an issue. So we can support more population. But increased population is not the only thing or even the primary thing that's leading to advances. It's really the exponential growth of our tools. I mean, the fact that I can carry around in my pocket a device that is 1,000 times more powerful than all of MIT shared when I was a student, and moreover is even more powerful than that because it ties into the entire worldwide network that carries much of human knowledge. And ultimately, our computers are not going to be limited to the tremendous power that's in that computer, but they're going to be tapping into the cloud of computing and have access to vast resources. And when we put computers in our brains, they will also be using cloud computing. So our tools also enable us to make progress a lot faster.
Thank you. It's a comment. I would like to have your view about this. I have a lot of discussions on Friday nights with my non-scientific friends and my family, saying, where you scientists are going to stop? And they say, we cannot stop progress. It's not possible. But you are changing and altering the nature equilibrium. And I said, yes, but I think and I believe that scientists can also correct the equilibrium. What do you think about that?
Well, you know, there's a countervailing force to the progress we're making. There's, in fact, less violence from war in the world, but you wouldn't know it to turn on your computer or to turn on CNN, because now we have a front row seat on everything that goes wrong. And what goes wrong is more interesting, so it's more newsworthy, but it's also worthwhile paying attention to so we can correct those problems. So when there's a battle in Fallujah, it's right in our living rooms. 50 years ago, if there was a battle in World War II where 20,000 people died one night, you didn't see it at all, except maybe in a grainy newsreel 3 weeks later at the movie theater. So we have much more awareness of the problems, and that's a good thing, because it does lead ultimately to solutions. But people don't have an accurate perspective. They should read Thomas Hobbes as to what life was like a couple hundred years ago. It was short, brutish, disaster-prone, poverty-filled, disease-filled. Human life was extremely hard, and very few people had jobs that gave them satisfaction and allowed them to be creative. They were lucky if they could survive. So people don't have an accurate perspective. We've overcome a great deal of suffering. There's still suffering to overcome. It is really only these exponentially growing information technologies that have the scale to address the major challenges of humanity. We just started something called Singularity University with backing from Google and NASA, which will be on the NASA Ames campus starting this summer. And Larry Page said that he wanted us to devote it to addressing the major challenges of humanity. So part of it will be a team project that addresses some key issue. But it comes from a perception that it's only these exponentially growing information technologies that can address poverty, energy, the environment, disease, and other issues that plague us. So stopping technology is in fact a popular intellectual movement, and I mentioned the 3 reasons why it's a bad idea. We still have a lot of suffering to overcome, and it would require changing our very idea of progress, implementing a totalitarian system, and in fact would make the world more dangerous.
Hello, Ray. Thank you for being here. What I wanted to ask you about was pertaining to singularity is near pages 378, 383, 384, Ich bin ein Singularitarian. You say here, there exists no objective test that can conclusively determine its presence in reference to consciousness. Science is about objective measurements and their logical implications, but the very nature of objectivity is that you cannot measure subjective experience. You can only measure correlates of it, such as behavior. And by behavior, I include internal behavior, that is the actions of the components of an entity, such as neurons and their many parts. Continuing on page...
Yeah, well, I get the idea.
I'm addressing something else here, sorry. So who am I? Since I am constantly changing, am I just a pattern? What if somebody copies that pattern? Am I the original or the copy? Continuing on 384, you say, if you do the thought experiment, it is clear that the copy may look like me, act like me, but it is nonetheless not me. It may not even know that it was created. I may not even know that it was created. Although he would have all my memories and recall having been me from the point in time of his creation, Ray too would have his own unique experiences, and his reality would begin to diverge from mine. I challenge this because I'm asking you, shouldn't we consider the ability at this level of technology to sync multiple substrates in one complex progressive pattern via nanobots' ability to attach, simulate, and recreate neural nets, communicating via wireless communication. Also, nanobot swarms having the ability to morph multiple bodies into one entity and vice versa. In reconsidering and designing the nature of human identity, this will increase decentralization, which is, I believe, what your dear friend here, Martine Rothblatt, would refer to as collective consciousness. You used the example of in the past sending a movie through the mail, whereas today we simply use email attachments. This is, as you stated, objective information technology. I guess what I'm stressing is the importance and growth of subjective experience communication technology.
Well, you're reading from the philosophy chapter, and there is actually an important role for philosophy, which was one of my main points, and I do have views on all of the issues that you touched on, but they are philosophical views. And one of my points is we can't create a consciousness detector that you put an entity in, okay, the green light comes on, this one's conscious, no, this one's not conscious, that doesn't have some philosophical assumptions built into it. And different philosophers would build in different assumptions. So John Searle would build in an assumption it has to be squirting biological neurotransmitters, and if it's not biological, it's not conscious. That's just his assumption, and he's argued that. Dan Dennett would argue that it has to be able to model its own decision-making. That's probably closer to my philosophical assumption. But different philosophers would build in different assumptions. It's actually a very profound issue that we cannot put ourselves in someone else's subjective shoes, and a lot of misunderstanding, discrimination, wars are fought over this. And we have arguments today about animal rights, because some people assume, well, animals just operate by instinct, which is some primitive machine-like process, and there's nobody really home. Other people, and I've put myself in that camp, feel that higher-level animals at least are having subjective experience. That's the whole issue underlying the animal rights debate. We're going to have the same debate about AIs, and in fact, that's the primary theme that's explored in the movie that Martine and I are working on. And it only goes to show that there is, in fact, a role for philosophy. And now some people, some scientists say, well, it's not a scientific issue, and I think you can show that it's not fully scientific, that you cannot resolve it just through objective measurement with measurement devices like science tries to do, and therefore it's just an illusion and it's not important. However, our whole moral system and our whole legal system is based on it. And so it's, I think, foolhardy to dismiss. My own view is that substrate is ultimately not important. And we're not, although there are thought experiments in there about, well, what if I copy myself and put myself in a machine? And that's actually not how it's going to go. It's going to be a slippery slope where we introduce non-biological intelligence and we gradually become something enhanced, something different. That's really the nature of being human. But ultimately, we will be more machine than biological. So we'll become transbiological. From a legal perspective, if you do that in a continuous way, you're keeping your legal identity, and I would argue you're keeping your subjective identity as well. If you do it in a disruptive way, then maybe you're not keeping your legal or subjective identity. I do point out in there that we change all the time. If you say, well, no, Ray, you're this biological stuff here. You're this physical hand. Here, let me take your hand. This is you. Well, no. These are completely different particles than they were 6 months ago. We can show that most of the cells turn over, literally die, and new cells created. Okay, the neurons last longer, but the components of the neurons, they die and are replaced. Literally every single part of us is turned over, certainly within 6 months, so I'm completely different stuff. But I do have a continuity of pattern, and I make the analogy to the pattern that water makes in a stream. The pattern looks the same, but the actual stuff, the water molecules, change in a matter of milliseconds, but it could look the same 6 months later. Or maybe it changes slowly, but there's a continuity of pattern. And there's a continuity of pattern that I represent. And as we gradually enhance ourselves through non-biological components, as some people have done by, say, a Parkinson's patient or someone with a cochlear implant, there's a continuity pattern. And I've asked people with Parkinson's, do you consider that computer in your brain and body to be part of you? And because you ask different people questions, you'll get different answers. But most say, yes, it's very much part of them, an important part, because it restored some functionality that is important to them. So there's a lot of rich issues which I explore in that issue. But I would agree with your basic sentiment that as we expand our intelligence through say, thinking out on the cloud and so on, that is going to be part of ourselves, even if we find it more difficult to find a geographical proximity for our identity.
I have two easy questions first. You mentioned the solar power tipping point. This is for photovoltaics. Why? I guess I'm not exactly sure what you mean by tipping point. Is that when people notice? Or
Well, I use tipping point in longevity, not solar panels.
Well, you use the
but
same
we did,
word.
but we did actually identify. Well, if you ask the question, is solar energy less expensive than fossil fuels? The answer
that's a tipping
depends
point. Okay.
a lot on the circumstances. It is less expensive than fossil fuels in some fairly narrow circumstances today, depending on where it is and other factors. It will be less expensive in most places within 5 years, was Larry Page and my conclusion that was adopted by the National Academy of Engineering. So that's kind of a tipping point. But it is already growing exponentially. It's been doubling every 2 years for 20 years. And it's only 8 doublings away from meeting 100% of our energy needs.
The other question is, I'm glad you're familiar with the spirochetes. When do you think they'll be developed and or commercialized? Since I'm working on it, I'd like to know. What kind of?
I expect that, I'd say by the end of the 2020s, around 2030, we'll be using routinely nanobots like respirosites, and that's fairly easy application compared to some others that have been proposed.
I guess the last question is, what is it different? I mean, you mentioned that the reason we've got this accelerated, law of accelerated terms is because we're dealing with informational technologies. What's different about information? I'm trying to get to the reason why.
Well, evolution, this has to do with my theory of evolution. And evolution is a process of creating greater complexity in information structures. And I go through 6 different epochs and different ways in which we've embodied information, starting with the ability of atoms, like carbon atoms, to link up and form information-rich structures because they can link up in 4 different directions. And we live in a universe that allows the embodiment of information in its physical structures. And if you have that, you will allow an evolutionary process. And we can show that in a computer. If you just run a simulation of evolution with information-rich structures, they will evolve. And you get actually intelligent solutions to problems. And we use that as genetic algorithms as one method in pattern recognition. So evolution has to do with information structures. So information technologies utilize increasingly effective, intelligent information structures to solve problems, and they are subject to the same law of acceleration. And you can see the acceleration when we simulate that in a computer.
Eric Jacobson, University of Illinois. Your talk gave me a new perspective on something that I had been thinking about in another context, and this was about molecular evolution, protein evolution. If you look at it from a domain point of view and try to reconstruct, what you find is that proteins have consistently been getting more complex in the sense of adding more and more and more functional domains, and the additional domains are typically domains that are involved in regulation or interaction, so that even adding just a couple of more domains gives you, as you say, an exponential increase in the number of different interaction paths and networks. But this led me to another thought about, at a different level, you had talked about artificial intelligence exceeding human intelligence at a certain point. And it seemed to me, I inferred from the context that you were talking about the intelligence of an individual human being. But it seems to me that this tremendous increase in our abilities to communicate with each other is also giving us, in a certain sense, some sort of increase in collective intelligence.
Well,
And
absolutely.
And I wonder if you have thoughts on how to measure that or assess that.
Well, you brought up 2 interesting issues, and that's a good insight. I'll use that in terms of evolution of complexity of proteins. However, there's a limit to how complex proteins can be in a practical sense, and that brings up actually what we see in genetic algorithms, that it will expand at an exponential pace and an accelerating pace, but then it saturates given the type of structures we allow a genetic algorithm to create. And biology is going to saturate, and it really pretty much is saturating. I mean, the evolution of human beings is not, it's continuing, and we do actually see genetic changes in the last 1,000 years, but it's insignificant compared to the acceleration of our technology. And it is really saturating in terms of the limitations of what biological evolution can do for us. So what happens then is you really need to introduce a new pattern, a new paradigm, a new way of evolving. And the paradigm that's going to supersede the natural biological evolution of proteins is our technology coming in and augmenting biology. That's what this whole conference is about, going beyond the limitations of biology by using our intelligence. But it's interesting to see exactly how biological evolution has increased the complexity of proteins, because that's exactly what evolution does. In terms of intelligence, if you just take an entity that has the flexibility of human intelligence, but marry it with some of the natural advantages of a computer, you already have something that's superior. Now, in many ways, we've done that through just the example you give, by using our technology to pool our intelligence, to keep track of our knowledge. But unassisted, we can't keep track of a handful of phone numbers, and your cell phone can remember millions of them. Machines can search through knowledge at electronic speeds. We're not able to do that. I mean, we routinely do things on our notebooks that are impossible with unaided human intelligence. So machines can pool their knowledge. If they have a skill, they can share at electronic speeds. We're sharing knowledge here, but at the speed of language, which is 1,000,000 times slower than electronic sharing. So the combination of the full flexibility of human intelligence with these natural advantages of machine intelligence will be a powerful combination. And then we can use the best examples of human intelligence in each area. I mean, what is human musical ability? Is it the guy who was whistling in the lobby this morning, or is it the Beatles or Beethoven? And so we can capture the best examples. And then the most important factor, and this is the idea that's really behind the singularity, is that intelligent machines, in my view, this is intelligent humans aided by our machines, will be able to look at this source code and improve it. And there'll be an iterative improvement cycle that'll get faster and faster. We can't do that so easily with our brains. Yes, we can add supplements and medications, and we can maybe do surgery. We've got some limited ways, but I can't just like reprogram my amygdala to be less afraid of something. And, Ramona does do that in the movie, though.
All right, we have time for one last question, and actually the break period has already begun, so if anybody needs to.
You might want to let your student
Okay,
ask.
yeah, okay. Last question.
I'll be brief. I'm interested in those stem cell experiments where you use DNA to replicate a pluripotent stem cell for genetic therapy. There's a lot of controversy in the field with cancerous stem cells, and when does a stem cell become cancerous, and or can cancerous stem cells be one form of stem cells? As we look at proteomics, lipidomics, metabolomics to actually now begin to differentiate cancer stem cells versus pluripotent normal stem cells, we may be able to use the power of nanotechnology to truly go after the cancerous stem cells and protect the normal stem cells. So, but something that I've always wondered about when we talk about trying to create a stem cell,
Well, this all
what drives that stem cell to stay pluripotent and not become oncogenic?
Well, this all has to do with reverse engineering biology. Martine and I at United Therapeutics are involved in this cancer stem cell project that Martine mentioned at MIT. We actually believe that the markers that the cancer stem cell field has been using are not correct. In fact, there's been some recent published papers that say exactly that. And we have identified a unique type of cell that does not use mitotic reproduction. It does both symmetric and asymmetric reproduction and appears to actually be a cancer stem cell. It's also a type of stem cell that leads to fetal organ development, organogenesis, which is consistent with the theory of cancer that adult tumors, at least many of them, are in fact fetal organs growing inappropriately in an adult because they grow exactly the same way with the same reproduction rate. And we've identified some unique, we can actually have pictures of these cells, which other people in the cancer stem cell field don't have. They've been doing it all with these markers on the surface of the cells, and have been begun to identify unique mechanisms of its reproduction, which are different than mitotic reproduction. It does a lot of single-stranded DNA reproduction, uses different chemicals like zeta polymerase, which are not used by eukaryotic cells. So anyway, it's very promising work. It's at an early stage now, but we hope to be able to actually destroy these cells uniquely in vitro and then in animal models and so on. Okay.
I'm
Last
currently
question.
studying your books, and one of the prevalent ideas in your book is the singularity, which is coming soon, presumably 2045. So I'm wondering, how will the singularity affect the collective consciousness that we're trying to develop in TerraSem?
Well, we can see powerful examples of that already. One of the things that this decentralized internet-based communication allows is to harness the wisdom of crowds. And if you set up, for example, a market mechanism, it can be remarkably wise in tapping all of the intelligence of a group of people in ways that no individual could possibly tap, and you can't do through committees. These betting mechanisms that were set up to experiment with this were amazingly accurate in both of the last two presidential elections, predicting every state quite accurately, much more accurate than the polls. There are interesting experiments where you put a bottle of jelly beans up on a table and ask individuals how many jelly beans there are. You get very inaccurate answers. You have a betting mechanism that you set up, and within minutes, it actually comes to a very accurate number. So a market mechanism can be intelligent. It's also subject to certain catastrophic breakdowns, as we've seen recently. So we don't fully understand it, but there are means of actually harnessing the wisdom of crowds. Sites that use user-created content can be very wise in terms of which intellectual ideas or videos rise to the top, and nobody has control over that, but it's this kind of a self-organizing mechanism, and it's become very influential. And despite the fact that, say, China is still nominally a communist country, it's deeply influenced by these 100 million blogs in ways that the authorities and really nobody can fully understand. So that collective consciousness is beginning, and it's not just a rudimentary phenomenon. I mean, this is, the blogosphere is very powerful. Look at Wikipedia. Things happen in, within hours. You have a well-reasoned article up there. If I were to say 10 years ago, we're going to create an encyclopedia, and anybody can write and anybody can edit entries, you'd say, well, that's ridiculous. It's going to be filled with graffiti and flames, and it's going to be a mess. It's amazing what the collective wisdom is able to create in terms of very rapid, quite accurate compendium of human knowledge that goes beyond what any encyclopedia would be able to create. So we have the early mechanisms of this collective consciousness as we begin to actually think out on the cloud, which even if these computers aren't yet quite in our bodies and brains, they're very close at hand. Yeah. And they allow us to share knowledge, and it is a harmony of both human and machine knowledge, and we're using artificial intelligence to find knowledge and then add to it in ways that cannot easily be predicted. So that collective consciousness has started, and we're very much today one world culture. You can see in the current climate it's one world economy. But ultimately, the same technology will enable us to overcome these particular economic challenges. And it is really an amplification of human intelligence. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and thank you so much. That was a beautifully harmonious note to end our keynote on. So thank you, Ray, for bringing it all together.